Well, folks, I think we're going to reward the folks who were here on time. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jeanne Howard, and I'm with the Donaldson Adoption Institute in New York. And I'll let Amanda Baden introduce herself when she gets back from rounding up a few more folks. We're really pleased to be with you this afternoon. Here comes somebody who can introduce us. Hi.
Cool, thanks. Professor at Illinois State University. She's Policy and Research Director of the Evan B. Donaldson Institute, and her PhD in social work at the University of Chicago, and her associated research there really pulls in that expertise from that field of child welfare and those perspectives. She has taught previously at the University of Illinois and Southeast Missouri State University as well. She serves on the Post-Adoption Task Force of the North American Council for Adoptable Children and received the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Adoption 2002 Excellence Award for her work in applied scholarship and research. And she was named a Congressional Angel in Adoption in 2006. Our other speaker today is Dr. Amanda Baden, Associate Professor in the Department of Counseling and Educational Leadership at Montclair State in New Jersey. She focuses her efforts in both research and clinical practice with adoption triad members, particularly in transracial international adoption issues and in the area of multicultural counseling competence. She co-created a model of identity for transracial and international adoptees called the Cultural Racial Identity Model, and has generated a range of texts and publications. Also on the board of the Adoption Quarterly Journal. She is also a senior research fellow at the Evan B. Donald Adoption Institute, and she co-chairs the biennial Adoption Initiative conferences in New York City held at St. John's, which she mentioned earlier today. In addition to her academic efforts, she seeks to connect with the community of adoption as a regular columnist for more popular publications for adoptive families and individuals, and was also named an Angel in Adoption by the Congressional Coalition. And her clinical specializations include counseling adoption triad members and transracial adoptees as well. She's a licensed psychologist with a clinical practice in Manhattan, and they will be talking today about adolescents, adoption, and identity. The first part will be their presentation, and then we'll have time for question and answers afterwards.
Thanks. Okay, I'm Jeanne Howard, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about identity development generally, but most specifically adoption identity development. And Amanda's going to speak more specifically to transracial, transcultural adoptive identity development. And we're both talking in the context of adolescence. So before I forget though, I want to direct you to a study that we did, which is more tied to Amanda's part of the presentation, and that she was very helpful to us with and used the tool, which is called Beyond Culture Camp, which is a publication that the Donaldson Institute did about 3 years ago, and it's on our website. And it was a survey of about 468, 70 adopted adults across the span, but we asked them many questions about their childhood, their adolescence. We had a group of about equal groups of Korean children adopted from Korea who are now adults, who adopted into white families, and white adopted persons who were adopted into white families in the U.S. And they found there were many similarities, but also significant differences, and it's just a helpful thing to look at because it reviews the literature on adoption and identity, and because it reviews the literature on adoption, identity, and transracial, transcultural identity. And so I think one of the points we want to make today is that everything is one big ball of yarn. It's not, you don't have your gender identity apart from your religious beliefs and identity, apart from your roles as daughter or mother or son, as apart from your sexual orientation, as apart from, all of what children and youth are trying to make sense of in adolescence is entire, it's kind of like a ball of variegated yarn if you're a knitter, the entire range and interconnection of selves that become one sort of meta self that sustains the young person as they move into adulthood. Okay, so we've studied identity as a phenomenon for a long time in the fields of psychology and related fields, but a lot of the early work was about aspects of identity that are chosen, particularly the relationships we choose, the vocations we choose, and the values that we hold. And while that, and sort of the Ericksonian model of stages through which one moves either to good effect or to good result or to bad result. And in Erickson's model, the adolescence was the time for identity crisis, which was either positively resolved in the sense of an achieved identity that was whole and useful and healthy, or that resulted in identity confusion that could haunt a person throughout life. But we've gotten a little more sophisticated in our understanding, and one of the things that we began to look at somewhat later were the whole aspects of non-chosen aspects of identity, the things that you are, that you don't choose. Gender, ultimately we understood sexual orientation in this framework, race, ethnicity, and so forth. So we began to expand our understanding of identity development to beyond the sort of ones that over which one has agency, and we found even more interesting things. And what we also know is, as was mentioned very clearly this morning, was that the whole physical, cognitive, and emotional changes of adolescence really open up the adolescent to reconsideration of who they are in relationship to their family, who they are in relationship to their peers, who they are relationship in their culture. And one of those aspects relates to, and I'm skipping some of these things because we really want to hear what you have to say, relates to adoption. One of the colors in that ball of variegated yarn is identity as an adopted person. And one of the interesting things about adoption identity is that it's not chosen or unborn. It is imposed, if you will. So it's not something that you just come with, and it's not something that you select. It's something that, in effect, somebody else selects for you. And so that as we begin to help youth and emerging adults think about who they are, where they fit, that's a different wrinkle. That's a different layer of identity and identity consideration that adopted persons have to go through. Further, we know that in our culture and in the larger society, as well as in the close peer network of adolescents, there are a lot of messages about adoption. There are positive messages, often that are overly simplistic. There are negative messages. Why didn't your real parents want you? There are messages about whether you should search or not search. There are messages about whether you should reject or accept the family that raised you. There's a whole set of cultural messages about what adoption is, what an adoptive family is, and what's an appropriate way to behave as an adopted person. And those adolescence is the time at which those messages become all the more salient and potent. Okay, so Hal Grodevin and others, Hal is a major researcher in this area of adoption identity, really began to help us think about adoption as an ascribed status. Not chosen, not born, but given, if you will. So it's different from some of the previous ones we've talked about. And a piece of that difference, and where adolescence comes in, is in the whole concept of power and control of life. We think about adolescence in terms of normal development as a way to individuate, separate, and begin to reconstruct one's sense of self moving forward as a young adult. A lot of that, and a lot of the power struggles that were talked about earlier today, and a lot of the tensions and terrors and challenges of adolescence or raising one, have to do with figuring out where your power lies, how to feel authentic to your sense of self, and how to begin to see likenesses and differences with your family as you move beyond your family, but still embedded in your family. And so the fact that that aspect of your identity, one aspect of your identity was ascribed to you, but not your choice, that adults, someone may not be known to you, made decisions that affected in this very important aspect of who you are, is another layer of thought, consideration, possibility that adopted people may need to work through. Related to that is that others control often access to the story about the origin of this condition and the truth of it. In my own research, I have found, and this is more anecdotal than quantitative, but I found many examples of adoptive parents having information that they did not share with the youth, and the youth later discovered that information, or they got a piece of the information but not the information in total, and the really complicated response that is for young people whose parents may often have been attempting to protect them, or at least that was their perception, and the child feels manipulated and denied some essential aspect of who they are. So others assign you this status. You have to deal with adoption identity because of other people, and others may control access, even including the state, who may not give you access to your original birth records and therefore the possibility of relationship or contact. So it can be a challenge, additional challenge to your sense of autonomy. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's an unbearable challenge. It's just yet another layer of considering who I am in relation to my family and where I'm headed. Okay. One of the things, I am referencing a study I did a few years ago where I did intensive interviewing over 2 in-depth interviews with young adopted women in adolescence and emerging adulthood. And it was pretty open-ended, and it was really fun, and I learned all kinds of interesting things, but one of them was about agency. Their sense that oftentimes, as they were coming to terms with who they are as an adopted person, that it was up in the air. And these are a couple of examples. It's like Russian roulette. Who knows where you're going to end up? Could be good, could be bad. I think a lot about that. Or sometimes I think about, what if this family hadn't answered the phone when the Department of Children and Family Services called? Somebody else, some other family had answered the phone. I would have been there. What would that have meant to who I am, and et cetera. We also, though, another theme equally powerful across these interviews was that this adoption was meant to be. Sometimes this is a message clearly conveyed by the family. I knew the minute I saw you that you were my daughter. When I got the picture, okay. But sometimes it appeared not to be a given message, but a chosen message or a co-constructed message between the adopted young person and their family. Sometimes it felt forced onto them, but often they reported that they too felt like God had a hand in this decision, fate had a hand in this decision, that there was something so good about the fit in this family that it was meant to be. And another message that young people shared was that they sometimes thought about, what would my life have been like? How might it have been different if I were with my original family? And this was particularly complicated for young people who didn't have access to much information, or certainly did not have contact with anybody in their original family. Okay. There's a couple of, Hal again, Hal and David Rosinski, and common names. They've been such guides to the rest of us over the years. But Hal and a colleague did a study of adolescent narratives, which is actually, my work was a study of narratives as well. And they in interviewing adolescents and reviewing their stories, came up with what they saw as 4 identity statuses, some of which, if not resolve pose difficulties for children, and some of which posit better outcomes. And one of them was unexamined identity. Doesn't matter, you don't care, I don't think about it. I think those of us who work with or study children who are adopted we have to be careful about our own bias, because mine is, well, you should be thinking about it. You know, I'm a grown-up. I think it's important. Why don't you think it's important? I think one thing we have to discern, or attempt to discern in our interactions with youth, is when is it denial and self-protection, and we may need to help youth move into consideration, and when is it they're not very mature yet. They're still they're not to that level. You know, Megan talked about, or Sally talked about that range of, pubescence. Well, you know that adolescence and puberty spur a lot of this introspection and this change. Maybe a young person isn't ready. I think if we're talking about a child who's not a child anymore, but a child who's sort of in later adolescence or emerging adulthood, that might be more of an issue for us. But they identified unexamined identity as the adolescent reporting that they think little about being adopted, they don't think it's important, or it's not very important. I certainly had young women in my study who fit that pattern. This is an example. Adoption isn't a big issue in my life. I don't know them, which is an interesting way to talk about original family. This young person never used any familial terms to describe family. I think who you are is not from where you're born, but from how and where you were raised. I think that's why people never know I'm adopted, where with some people you can really tell. My parents made me. They didn't form me physically, but they made me who I am. This young woman started our interview bringing in her family album and saying, if you looked at this, could you tell which one wasn't adopted? Nobody guesses it's me. Nobody guesses that I'm adopted. They always think my birth sister is the adopted one. So right from the beginning, she felt the need to convince me that adoption didn't matter, and in fact, she physically resembled her family more than her sister did by birth. Okay. The next status that Dunbar and Grotevin identified is called limited identity. It's sort of on the periphery. It's an issue. But there's not a real strong pull or desire to mull it over or sort it out. There's more of a matter-of-fact approach. And here's a quote that illustrates that. Adoption isn't something that's sat in front of me my whole life. It wasn't an issue at a time. It was an issue at a time in my life, but it's not a big issue any longer. Our family had problems. Every family has problems. It wasn't like our family was different from other families. I don't get up every morning and say, today I'm adopted. I don't think much about it unless something triggers it, which Dunbar and Grotevin would call limited identity. It's there, it's acknowledged, but it's not in the front. I should tell you that during this study, I came up with a metaphor from one of my participants who said, sometimes adoption is capital A and sometimes it's a little a. And I really liked that, because she said it's always there. Adoption is always there, but sometimes it's there as a little a and sometimes it's there as a capital A. Well, this is a little a response. I also have capital A responses. Okay. Okay. So unsettled identity is when adolescents or emerging adults are in the process of trying to make sense of this additional aspect of who they are, but they haven't quite worked it through. It is a struggle. It is a challenge. It's something that is on their mind. It's not matter of fact anymore. It may not necessarily be paralyzing or omnipresent, but it's present, and it's present pretty significantly. So it's there with a capital A. And this was a young woman who illustrates that struggle. I have this history, and if I tell people I'm adopted, what does it do to all the history I've made? Does that make it less valid? I guess I'd rather be in a sort of denial and just let my life be, but is that who I am? Is adoption what makes me a person? I've met my birth mother. That matters too. You have to think about, who am I? How did I become this way? I guess there's something I'm feeling every day. So there's a lot of there's a lot of stuff going on there, but there's not resolution. There's a lot of active, I don't know, should it matter, should it not matter, which is typical of unsettled identity. And then what Hal and Dunbar called integrated identity, which is similar to what Erickson called achieved identity, and James Marcia has called identity achievement, that the process is engaged in. It's engaged in fully, it's engaged in meaningfully, and some resolution has occurred. Some kind of, okay, I'm adoption. Sometimes it's a little A, sometimes it's a big A, and I'm okay with that. So, this is the adolescent or emerging adult who's actually gone through the process of thinking, maybe only internally, but thinking, often talking, considering, moving back and forth in their notion of how important this is, how salient it is to their sense of self, but is synthesized, being adopted along with everything else that they are into a place where it's okay. This is an example. I think being adopted has influenced almost every aspect of my personality and my life. It's why I plan to be a teacher. It's why I want to be a mother. It's how I know what to do and what not to do. This young woman was adopted from foster care from a very complicated situation. The things that have happened to me, abuse and neglect, have made me crazy at times, but they've made me strong too. And so has the love and support of my parents. So here's a young woman who's pulling together multiple threads of her complications of her life and saying, and you know what? I'm okay. And I'm going to be a teacher, and I'm going to be a good mother, and I'm going to be all of these things. And I folded adoption into my sense of who I am after having thought long and hard about its meaning. That's not to say that kids who achieve an integrated identity are done. Throughout the life course, there are constant triggers to reconsideration of identity. But it's as if the next time around is unlikely to be as unsettling and as all-pervasive and as obsessed about as it was at this period. But when people have children, when birth parents, a connection is made, when adoptive parents die, there's a whole host of other triggers. But when kids have come to an integrated identity, or most likely they do it in young adulthood, not actual adolescence, those things are less, they don't knock them off their pins quite as much. Okay. So what gets in the way of healthy identity formation in adopted adolescents? We've talked about a couple of things. One is lack of information. If people don't share, or if there really aren't a lot of pieces of information about your past, there's a lot more room for wondering, fantasy, speculation, doubt, etc. Contact, if adopted youth do not have relationship or contact or access to information about their original families, that's another gap that sometimes makes this a little more complex, etc. Okay, and context. Some understanding. What we find, and it's important to note this, what we find is that narratives don't often grow with kids. Parents are often, and others in the child's immediate life, are often pretty good at a story that fits an 8-year-old, maybe a 3-year-old, 8-year-old. But after that, stories in the family sometimes don't grow as the child does. And so the young person is creating their own story, often in the absence of a supportive story from the family that conveys more information as it is developmentally appropriate, or that wonders along with the child. If a parent gives them a message that it's okay to wonder, let's wonder together, I wish I knew, it must be so hard not to know what day you were born, or it must be so hard not to know if you have any siblings, or et cetera, that's that kind of communicative openness that David Brodzinski and others, Beth Hall, have talked so much about helps. But what we find is sometimes parents don't know quite where to go with the story, particularly if they're very negative aspects, and so they don't go anywhere with the story. Or they give the message that it's not okay for the child to ask or seek clarification or whatever. I think it often comes from a place of protection and love, but it does not protect its community. Okay. The sense of difference that was alluded to in a couple of presentations this morning can be salient when one is in adolescence, and there are, particularly when there are not models. Your parents aren't adopted, typically. They don't know how to kind of walk that path in front of you and anticipate questions and prepare you. Many times adopted children don't know anybody who's adopted. It doesn't mean they don't know anybody who's adopted, but they don't know anybody that they know who is adopted. And they often feel a sense of isolation and difference that's significant for lack of that contact. This is something one of my young women said to me. she said to her mom by adoption, "You know who you came from, your history. Why can't you understand how hard it is for me that I don't have that?" If all our kids could say that, they would be and we would be in much better shape. But it's, I think, the rare kid who can say, you don't have an experience that I'm having, help me have that experience. Okay. We've talked about communicative openness and also David's stress and coping model of adoption adjustment, but there will be times throughout life where stresses related to adoption will be in the fore, and the individual in the context of family and peers has better or fewer resources for coping. One of the things that gets in the way is inauthentic discourse, whereby people tell the 8-year-old story as the child continues to grow, make it clear either directly or indirectly that talking about original family, talking about circumstances of removal is not okay. They may never say those words. They may say like this: "You can talk to me anytime you want to about adoption." Please don't, please don't, please don't. Again, I think it's often an aspect of love. It's sometimes an aspect of, I don't know what the heck I'm supposed to do if you do ask. Some of what I know is negative, so please don't ask, but it's okay to ask. Subtle messages of disapproval, the internalized sense of disloyalty that many young adopted people report as they begin to want to know more, speculate, or even seek out contact with their original family. They often, the women in my study often talked about, I was afraid I would hurt my parents if I went looking. I didn't think they would ever understand. I would think they would think I was rejecting them, so I kept it a secret. It's so easy to search now. I did this study some time ago. The internet was not as much of a factor, but many of these women searched before they were of legal age, and that is only going to happen more so. And they, without their family to guide them. Some of them had families who genuinely wanted to help them look, find, and interpret what they found, and those were really kind of magical relationships where the child, the youth, really trusted the parent to give them what they needed. Okay. Disenfranchised grief, the notion that people, particularly non-adopted people, often emphasize the gain of adoption, and the loss of adoption is sometimes ungrieved or unsupported. The grief of grieving it is unsupported, so that's another aspect that makes adoption different. And pervasive, often simplistic cultural messages that stigmatize and idealize adoption or delegitimize it, both. Okay. Read beyond culture camp. Okay. I wanna add that another huge issue. I'm gonna add two quickly. Is physical resemblance. I didn't anticipate or build into my study any questions about physical resemblance, and it came up time and time and time again. It came up in a multiple of ways. I met my original family, and I can't believe how much I have some aspect of them. I've never met them, and I've always wondered who I look like. Or I can't stand it, my grandpa keeps telling me how much I look like my mother because I wasn't born to her and I don't look like my mother, and does that mean I'm not a legitimate member of this family if I don't look like somebody? And so, but in every interview, physical resemblance came up. And I wanted to just read you a quote about it, if I can find it. And if I can't, I'll read you this one. Okay. Oh, here we go. I got this letter from my birth parents with pictures, and I look just like them. But it's scary because I don't even know these people, and I look like them. It's frightening to see the eyes of my father because they're mine. But it was also a satisfying feeling. It sort of filled up that hole, that empty space in me. It was finally like, now I understand. This is why I look the way I do. The one thing that bugged me growing up, this is another respondent, was that I didn't look like anybody. I wanted to look like somebody. That's why it's so neat to see that I actually look like my biological mother. I've never really looked like anyone. Okay. So physical resemblance is a particular, I think it's an issue in all adoption because the lack of physical touchstones, the false claiming of looking like, the never knowing. But I think it's a particular issue for children adopted across race or ethnicity. I wanted to share with you one of my respondents, and move into Amanda, talking about her section. I had 6 of my women who were adopted across race, and none of them had ready access to others in their teen years who were of the same race, rarely to even other minority people of color anywhere. As one woman said, I was the diversity in my high school. Their parents were not derogatory, or were not actively racist in presentation, but none of the parents of these women in my study made any special effort to connect children to the culture of their birth parents, not even culture parents, which is insufficient, but they didn't even do that. One young woman I talked to was immensely vocal about this, and she had been adopted through Hope. She was living in St. Louis, where there were very few other Asian children, but there was such a mixture that nobody was in the majority and everybody was a minority kind of thing. And then her family moved to a community where, as she put it, I was the only non-white face for 50 miles. And she had a keen sense of difference, and it was difficult for her to sort out the adoption difference and the racial and ethnic difference, but a keen sense of difference and isolation that was very painful to her, that complicated her positive development of a sense of self, and that she never shared with her parents. So here's Kristen's quote. The community I grew up in wasn't necessarily accepting of difference. My adoption was never an issue, really, but racial differences were. I was never discriminated against, but I was always just different. Like in junior high, one of my nicknames was Chink. Not to mention the childhood about this included, but it's not only offensive, but it's inaccurately offensive. I didn't like it. Right. I didn't like it, but I didn't want to draw more attention to myself, and eventually everyone started calling me that, much to my chagrin. What are you going to say about that? What are you going to do? She then reported that she felt her parents could not understand it, and that reporting it to them would cause them pain, and also they might act in a way that caused a stir and made them sick. Here's her concluding comment, which always trips me up. It wasn't until later in life when I read the Joy Luck Club. There's a part where this white kid is making fun of the narrator and calls her this racist name. And she goes home and her mother holds her because she knows the pain of her daughter. I would have liked to have had that.
Right. Speaking of Korea, and I'm not even Korean, but I play one sometimes. So. Yeah. Oh yeah. This thing, I miss my Mac. Okay. All right. So, adolescence and identity. Thanks for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you about this. I was thinking about, all these thoughts were running through my head as Jeanne was talking about identity and about how I wanted to talk about what happens for adoptees during adolescence. And I was thinking about all of the kids that I've worked with over the years, because I've been in the lucky position of having a wealth of adolescent adoptees in New York City who have come to groups that I've done, and so they have been the greatest teachers to me. And it's very interesting to watch their process, because certainly a lot of the things that were talked about today during Megan's talk and the panel discussion are true, in that things happen in those adolescent years that can get very ugly, certainly. But also I've noticed so much that a lot of times the work for transracial and international adoptees it can be more focused on various levels of salience for different aspects of identity. And for transracial adoptees, race is a very salient identity. But despite these kids that I've been working with growing up in New York City, we think of as the most diverse place in the country. They've still grown up in very isolated communities within New York City. So often, although they're riding on the subway next to people of color, within their homes, they don't see too many of them. And if they do, there are other kids who are adopted just like them. So one of the big challenges has been for them to develop a sense of their own identity. And as myself, I'm also an adopted person, and so naturally I have to start at the end and then move backwards. So let me, don't look. Let me just jump ahead. There's a quote that I want to read to you that I realized I wanted to start with, but I didn't realize it until later. Oops, wait. Now I'm too far. There it is. Okay, I just got this email a couple days ago from a 25-year-old Korean adoptee in British Columbia. And this is an excerpt from the email. I really have no clue how I got onto your site. My family is white. I have no sense of identity, but it's not really a major issue for me. My parents weren't able to have children of their own, and I have 2 older brothers, twins, who were adopted from BC, Canada. They're white too. Maybe I have a sick sense of humor or repressed emotions on being a visual minority, not only within communities my whole life, but within a family as well. But I enjoy stereotyping jokes, mostly because I don't identify myself as any race. If so, it would be white. But I think all racial stereotypes are kind of amusing. My friends call me the white Asian, and I commonly refer to myself as the Twinkie or banana. Some people are shocked when I joke about it, but once they understand my humor, they join in. Makes for a good laugh. Hearing an offensive racial comment more than likely wouldn't even faze me, because I probably wouldn't understand it. I haven't thought about if that's just ignorance on my part, the lack of exploring my real cultural background, or the fact that my adoption story from my parents has always been positive and happy, to the point that I'd rather explore their cultural background and treat it as my own. If you were curious as to where in South Korea I was born, the answer is Seoul, but I didn't want to spell it, because it came to my attention that I don't even know how to spell it, and is currently underlined in red. I'll leave it so you catch my drift. I have never really discussed being a transracial adoptee before, especially with other people just like me. So this is our first conversation with me, an anonymous stranger, on email 4 days ago, or 3 days ago. It said a lot to me, certainly that we know that, and I did this group just a couple weeks ago as well, with some teenage girls, Chinese adoptees, who were thinking they were planning their college application, visits, etc. And among that group was a teen who has lived for the past 4 years in Hong Kong, and is a Chinese adoptee, but learned no Chinese while she was there, and said, well, I really refer to myself as a Twinkie. And the other girl said, oh, but I call myself a banana, and they were debating the merits of both labels. And so I was thinking about how, and I said to them at this point, you might not believe anything I have to say at this moment, but hopefully someday you'll hear my voice and say, oh yeah, she said that at one point, that you don't have to ignore all of these parts of yourself, and that you can think about yourself as a racial being, and it's okay to see yourself in that way, that you don't have to pretend that you're not any race in order to be accepted. And so one of the things I think that kids, particularly transracial adoptees, struggle with is this salience of race and identity. Because so often they've grown up wanting to not acknowledge it in any way. They've learned the colorblind way. And because a lot of times their parents haven't figured out how to talk about their own racial and ethnic experience, they too have kind of fostered and promoted that colorblind perspective. And so they grow up with very little language to talk about their racial and ethnic experience. This email from this young woman is a good example of some of the work that I've been trying to do. And now I'm going to have to go forward again, so please bear with me. Oops, okay. Almost there. So transracial and international adoptees' identity. I think that when adoptees are trying to understand their own racial experiences and cultural experiences, they look at the socio-political concerns around them. They have to negotiate the acquisition of their birth culture and people from their own race into their identities, and that can take quite a while sometimes. And we know that transracial adoptees also have multiple adoptions. They were relinquished and joined a new family. That was one adoption. They also adopted, if you will, and internalized the white culture, which was yet another adoption for them. And I think many adoptees go through a process of reclamation of their birth culture, and that becomes yet another adoption in their world. And so I think that adoptees, transracial adoptees, have to integrate their experiences with an internalization of racism, discrimination, and oppression. So what I did, let's see, who knows what the next slide is at this point? Certainly not me. It's all messed up now. We'll see. Okay, there. Hey, that's good. So what I've been working on is, and this paper is going to come out in the fall, on reculturation. And so we were talking about how do transracial adoptees who are trying to figure out their own identity experiences understand what those identity experiences are. How do they go from a period in which people think, oh, well, you're Korean, you must have a Korean cultural background. But we know that transracial adoptees who've grown up with white parents have a lived experience that's anything but Korean. Right? Their lived experience is the white cultural experience of their adoptive parents. And so in order to think about how they are trying to make sense of this expected identity that they should have is this process that we named reculturation. And the reason we came up with this name is because when we looked at things like other terms, acculturation or enculturation, none of those, even reverse acculturation, they didn't fit because the primary objective here is the act of reclaiming lost birth culture and acculturating, if you will, to a minority culture. So when we think of acculturation, typically we think of acculturating or taking on aspects of that dominant culture in society. But when transracial adoptees are doing this, it's not the dominant culture that they're trying to gain. They're trying to gain a minority culture that's not as present or as accessible to them. So these are the reasons that we started to develop this, and I'm going to speed through a little bit so that we have time to discuss and have questions. So essentially, though, adoptees are trying to find where they fit, and a lot of times this happens in adolescence or early adulthood, where they start this readoption, reclamation process. And we know that this happens because when we look at the process through which adoptees become part of the members of their new families, we can see the points at which their birth cultural enculturation stopped and their assimilation to their adoptive culture begins. So adoptees, I think, are of course immigrants, but they don't, very, very rarely, transracial international adoptees are immigrants, they very rarely identify themselves as immigrants. And they don't have the same immigrant experience that we know other immigrant people do. So I think it's an interesting facet of them being a large ongoing wave of immigration, yet one that doesn't have that immigration experience that we typically think of, because they jump social classes and they automatically assimilate to their adoptive families. Because we know that when children are adopted internationally, regardless of their age at placement, their assimilation to adoptive parents' culture is, in a sense, forced assimilation for survival, just to be able to speak or eat or get basic needs met. And also, I think it's also a byproduct of attachment. So bonding and making connections to adoptive parents is another way in which that reason that assimilation occurs. So I've just defined reculturation as that reclaiming of birth culture. And as I said, it came from this construct of acculturation. And I think that reculturating refers to that attempt to become proficient in the practice of birth culture. And it can be an active or a passive process. Reculturative activity, we've referred to it, we all are familiar with this. A lot of times adoptive parents have attempted to provide reculturative activity for their children. And that can be any kind of behavior or tradition, attitude, or belief that promotes adoptees' attempts to regain cultural knowledge, awareness, skill, or experience. So that can be things like education or language courses or heritage tours or study abroad. All of those kinds of things can fall under the rubric of reculturative activity. And then the age of reculturation, as I said, we think it takes place in late adolescence and early adulthood. And it often refers to when adoptees, through their own initiative, not through their parents' initiative, begin this process of reclaiming birth culture. And in essence, they have to also leave behind their honorary white status that they have through their adoption into white families. And because often as they grow and mature and become adults, they no longer pass as white. So this is, you can see it, this is what the model looks like. And it sort of shows you the typical process for a transracial international adoptee. I purposefully say transracial international adoptee because a lot of times international adoptees are just seen as separate and not, people often don't even recognize it as a form of transracial adoption, but I believe we have to recognize that because by and large, almost all international adoptions are transracial. Other than the few from Russia that are taking place now, most of them are transracial. So with international adoption, we know that the child is born in their native country and then relinquished for adoption. That enculturation begins immediately upon their birth, and some would even argue while they're in utero. Enculturation refers to the way in which people learn their culture, and it's provided through sights, sounds, smells, interactions, all of those different things. So the culture of the birth countries being enculturated into the child, and that can continue through that relinquishment and temporary care, which can be foster care or an orphanage or what have you, assuming that the caregivers are also from that same birth culture. And then upon adoptive placement, when the child is placed with their white adoptive parents, enculturation stops at that moment, and assimilation immediately begins. I don't know if any of you saw Wo I Ni Mommy. Did anyone see that film on PBS? Okay. So in Wo I Ni Mommy, you can see immediately when the enculturation is ending. And it's a film about an 8-year-old Chinese adoptee who was being adopted by a family in Long Island. So she had been living in a foster family for much of her life. And then as she gets placed with her adoptive family while she's still in China, but in a hotel there, her new adoptive mom is beginning to teach her English and all of the things, they're speaking only in English to her, so that enculturation stops immediately and assimilation must begin then. And I get questions a lot about this aspect of assimilation because people, there's a lot of negative connotations that go with the idea of assimilation. But I really believe that it has to occur in order for adoptees to survive. I've known lots of course anecdotal, I don't have any data on this, but in only very rare cases have adoptees who were older at the age of their adoption been able to maintain their birth language. And that's only when the adoptive parents are fully fluent and can continue that language with them. But kids who were adopted at 9 years old, even with siblings who also spoke their language, lose the language very quickly and must learn to speak in their adoptive parents' language. So that assimilation occurs, and the immigration then occurs. So adoptees immigrate to their new adoptive country, and then through parents' efforts, they can be exposed to these different reculturative options. And that's, I don't know how this works. That's right here where the education, experience, and immersion, those are the three kinds of options. So education, we know we can take them to Chinese language classes or Korean dance or drumming classes, right? And then we also can have some experiences where we maybe take them to a culture day or to some sort of other cultural event. And then some immersion activities can even occur where there's heritage tours or study abroad, for example. Those kinds of activities are often parent-initiated and adoptee-resisted. And so a lot of families have asked me also, well, is there any way to avoid this process? And I think the assumption is that the process is one that is so negative that we should avoid it. And I think that this is just one of those processes that adoptees experience when you have this transition from one culture to another and one experience to another. And that after the adoptee goes through these reculturative activities, when they start to initiate their own attempts at reculturation, that's when these 5 different outcomes are possible. We have the adoptee culture, reclaimed culture, bicultural, assimilated culture, and combined culture as the different options. So I went through these phases already. So I'm going to give you some examples that I've located in the literature from people's own, a lot of the anthologies of adoptees' writings and other interviews with adopted people have resulted in great examples of each of these different kinds of reculturation activities and reculturation outcomes. So this is an example of an education approach to reculturation. As I searched for my own identity, I discovered that in order to find my true self, I had to seek out my heritage. Through studying the language, history, and culture of Korea, I was able to understand my unique background and relate that to my present situation. In doing so, I was able to reconcile with myself and understand my role in this hybrid society that was the United States. This is an example of experience. Children need to have a sense of pride in their own heritage. They should be allowed to celebrate as many cultural activities as they so choose, and only if and when they freely choose. I have every right to embrace my Irish American heritage today and my Korean heritage tomorrow, without question or ridicule. This is the right of every multicultural person. And then the immersion approach is, one day I decided that I was not going anywhere here in America. I was missing something. I intended to search for my biological family, find a piece of myself, and belong in a society without the kind of racial discrimination I had experienced in the United States. I thought, hurry, speak Korean, and you will be a real Korean. So I said there's 5 outcomes that we talked about as possibilities. This one I think is a really prominent one that we don't talk enough about in the literature, about the adoptee culture. And I think that because there's an assumption that a lot of times transracial adoptees will either identify most highly with their birth culture or most highly with their adoptive parents' culture, but there's another alternative, which is I think the culture of being adopted. And it's a pretty real culture that I think a lot of adult adoptees that I know find that that's the culture they feel most comfortable within. So here's an example of that. At times I began to feel alone and impatient because I always had to explain myself. After some time I met several Oaks, overseas adopted Koreans, who could relate to me and understand me for myself. I found Oaks are different in our own ways because our upbringings and individual experiences are influenced through our respective adoptive countries. There's the reclaimed culture, which is another outcome, and this is where the adopted person who chooses to go and live in their birth country, immerse themselves fully, try and stay there and become and pass authentically, competently, proficiently within their birth culture. In speaking with other Korean adoptees, I've noticed that many have changed their names back to those given them at birth or have returned to Korea to live. There they learn to speak, eat, and breathe Korean culture. They search for their birth families or reach out for Korean lovers. Some reach for anything and everything, literature, movies, music, cookbooks that has the word Korean in it. Another outcome is bicultural, and this is where the individuals identify with their white adoptive culture that they've assimilated to and that they've lived within, and to their hyphenated American ethnic group. So the hyphenated American ethnic group, for example, Korean American or Chinese American, Ethiopian American ethnic group. So the example, my ethnicity is Korean. The culture I was raised in was Anglo-Saxon. I claim rightful heritage to both. I've learned the prides and pitfalls of two worlds that are both ugly and beautiful. I was rejected and embraced by both, and I embrace and reject them in kind. In doing so, I found that, though they are each an essential part of me, they do not define who I am. And the assimilated culture. This is where an adopted person may want to, they've continued to assimilate to their lived culture, their lived adoptive white American culture. And they may attempt to hold on to their honorary white status. In this case, they may or may not have gone through the process of trying to reculturate. It may be an explored identity or an unexplored one. I can't count the number of days or times that I would wish and pray and beg to wake up with blonde hair and blue eyes, stand 5 feet 8 inches tall, and be sleek and slender. I was a diversity in my high school, and this is the one I think you're reading. I denied my ethnicity and did everything in my power to assimilate, to emulate how white and non-Asian I was. I felt like a banana most of my life. This is another person. In other words, racially Asian due to my skin, but in terms of my inner values and cultural identity, I felt very much Caucasian due to my upbringing within my adoptive family. I still feel this way. And then lastly, the combined culture. And this is basically a combination of the previous ones that I just described. Throughout my struggles, I've become a very strong person. I know that if I had never gone to Korea, I would not feel this way. My journey there has helped my longing to actually be proud. When I look at myself, I see a Korean American adoptee. I do not see that I am only a Korean American. Korean Americans are very different by upbringing and by belief. Nor am I just a Korean. I tried that one on, it didn't fit. I am a Korean American adoptee. That's how I define myself. I'm not ashamed of it. I'm proud. I can teach many people so many things. So I know I wanted to make sure we have time to speak about some things, but I think, one of the things that I think that this model helps explain is something that I wrote about in the past, which is a cultural racial identity model that is complicated and don't have time to go into. But essentially, I think it helps explain the ways in which people form their identities and those potential identities that exist. And lastly, I wanted to share something that a client shared with me that she's given me permission to share when I do talks. And this is a client who is in her 20s and was going through a lot of different identity challenges. And she drew this for me. She's artistic, obviously. And was drawing how she saw her own identity transition. And she did it a lot by how she dressed and how she wore her hair and how she affiliated herself. And so she said in high school she was reading Allure religiously. She wore dresses and heels and bizarre outfits and was fashion forward, spent hours in front of the mirrors doing her hair and makeup, and was praised, had good girlfriends, etc. And then she was a freshman and she had a soaring ego and confidence, looking down at her nose at people back home, and was one of the prettiest people in her program and pursued by, I'm not sure what that means. She had long talks about love and idealized Sex in the City and was doing well in school. By her sophomore year, though, she was becoming miserable in her program, making lots of new friends, especially with actors. She's so proud of her new friends who were so beautiful and cool, and fell in love with somebody and had an obsessive dream life with another person. By the time she went to Europe, she had cut off all her hair, suffered a huge ego blows with feeling appealing to men, and was losing a sense of style and am I feminine or masculine was one of her big questions. By her junior year, she had a breakdown over leaving or staying at her school, hating her program and living off of campus, but still happy, more concerned with her social life than school. By her senior year, and that summer before her senior year, she has Edie Sedgwick, took up smoking, happy to be in her new house. You can see all of these different identity transitions here. She liked somebody else, a different man, and then her house became obsessed with the L word, and she started dressing like one of the characters in the L word, and acting like her. And one of her previous boyfriends reappeared in her life, and then she started being friends with some other friends, other women, took up the guitar, not interested in school. She and the boyfriend broke up, or maybe I think there was a girlfriend actually. She alternated between all of these different looks and became frustrated and didn't know what to do and didn't know how to dress, and didn't know how to deal with being attracted to both sexes. By the time she was in the local area, she was still back and forth and dressing very androgynously, struggling between her masculinity and femininity. And by the time she had come to see me, she was still struggling with her sexual orientation and with how she perceived herself, and had not even begun to start to explore her racial identity at that point, because it was so painful for her. And her adoption was at the tip of the iceberg for her in terms of thinking about how she could position the way it had worked out in her life. So these identity struggles, the way our clients think about them and write about them are really interesting, I think. I want to make sure we have time to discuss this, so I'm going to stop there, and we can have some discussion here from some of your cases and take questions. Thanks.